Welcome back, everyone. I just want to thank everyone who listens to my true crime episodes. All the cases I cover on this channel are real and well documented. I never post fiction, just raw true crime. I'm going to leave the screen black again so that there is no extra light coming if you are trying to sleep. Let's get straight into the first story. He grins under the studio lights, darts thudding into a board, the host teasing out small talk about the coast and hobbies. Freeze that frame. Now lay it beside a farmhouse reduced to ash, beside rope burns, a sawn-off's cruel signature, a community held in fear. How did a TV quiz show unmask a murderer? In late 1980s, Pembrokeshire, break-ins became ritual humiliation. Then 2 double homicides ripped the county open. Families waited decades. A survivor remembered blue shorts. A shotgun spoke in patterns. And an archive tape held a face. To understand the TV clue, we need to go back. At the time, the intruder moved like a rumor that kept proving itself. Isolated farmhouses, bungalows down narrow lanes, coastal cottages with one road in, and hedgerows for cover. Night after night, doors kicked, windows pried. He wore a balaclava, used a sawn-off shotgun, and spoke in short, commanding phrases. People complied because a barrel leaves no room for negotiation. What stands out now, in retrospect, is that he did not just steal, he managed people. Victims described hands bound, mouths gagged, lights turned off, curtains drawn. He would separate partners, keep a running commentary, threaten, then force compliance by demonstrating he knew the house, where the keys were, where the cash tin sat, the drawer with the rings. The psychology of the moment is important. He controlled time, making minutes feel like hours, keeping fear peaked while he took what he wanted. Meanwhile, the pattern spread. Reports came in from different beats on different nights. A rural force with thin coverage tried to capture a moving shadow. Some incidents involved assaults, others were strictly acquisitive. Fires, here and there, looked like distraction or rage. A few scenes showed arson used as a cleansing ritual, and yet, for all this, there was not a single offender profile pinned to the wall. The cases were filed by type: burglary, aggravated burglary, assault. Different teams handled different harms. Linkage blindness took root. Victims talked about humiliation. He would make them lie on floors, face down, or sit in a room while he moved through their belongings. He paced calmly, sometimes talked about the coast, sometimes swore, and always returned to the threat of the shotgun. Some remembered a rough accent, West Wales, not a stranger's intonation. Others noticed gloves that left odd impressions, a rope with a particular twist, a habit of cutting telephone lines. Details that felt big in the moment risked being lost in the flood of reports. Forensics at the time offered little relief. Minimal DNA, if any, because gloves, masks, and controlled touch limited transfer. Shotgun wadding was recovered in some scenes, but wadding is common, and pellets disperse. Bootprints were partial, distorted by farm mud or carpet nap. Fibers turned up, blue and synthetic. But the labs of the late 1980s could not parse their significance beyond a general class. The scenes were tidy in a way that suggested experience. Doors resecured, windows closed, curtains back in place. Staging in micro. He wanted victims to remember him, not his route. So why did fear not force a clampdown? It did. Locks changed. Dogs slept indoors. Farm gates got new chains. But Pembrokeshire is a county of long distances and hidden corners, where the sea gives you both edge and escape, and the landscape absorbs sound. Patrol cars cannot be everywhere. While that was happening in Haverfordwest, something else occurred near a coastal lane. Reports could not always connect across parishes. There were early hints of escalation. A woman reported assault layered onto a burglary's routine. Another described a knife against the skin. A shed torched after a raid felt like punishment for resistance. He experimented, but retained discipline. The sawn-off functioned as lever, the rope as ritual. He walked out with cash, coins, jewelry, sometimes souvenirs whose meaning only he understood. Inside the force, investigators debated, multiple offenders mimicking each other, or one methodically developing. Without a face, it was safer administratively to segment. In hindsight, this fragmented the story, and the offender learned from each intrusion. He tested response times, learned which lanes offered cover, which homes kept cash at hand, which people obeyed fast when their partner was threatened. Micro-stories accumulated. A farmer woke to the cold circle of a barrel pressing his temple, the clock ticking loud to his ear as his wife sobbed in the dark. An elderly woman saw a torch beam cut her ceiling, heard floorboards she knew by creak, and waited for the voice to speak from the doorway. A child in a back room counted the footsteps and watched the red digits of a radio alarm switch minutes, praying it would end. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In these homes, it was forced. Police briefings became a ritual too. Maps, pins, corridor rumours, and the same questions. Local or transient, drifter or neighbour. What nobody knew at the time was that the offender's knowledge of footpaths and hedged back routes outmatched the patrol grid. He was not driving streets, he was cutting fields. The community adapted, then numbed. Lock checks, light timers, phone trees among farmers, new routines. But fear settled into night air. You could feel it at pubs when talk turned to burglaries. Voices dropped, eyes cut to doors. The offender felt that, and he kept going. Then something unexpected happened. Firefighters were called to a farmhouse. Smoke rose straight in the still air. A neighbour counted minutes, helpless. The intruder's pattern had crossed a line from controlled invasion to murder, and the county would never see its nights the same way again. 3 days after a string of routine burglaries, the call came in just after dusk. Fire at Scoveston Park. The farmhouse sat back from the road, a long drive, outbuildings, hedges trimmed neat. When crews arrived, flames were running the ceiling, but the burn pattern was unusual and unsettling. Hot spots in rooms that should not have ignited first. Furniture positioned in ways that did not match a hurried escape. The psychology of the moment is important. Whoever set this, if it was set, wanted the scene to read as accident while hiding something worse. Inside, firefighters moved with masks and axes, then stopped. 2 bodies, Richard Thomas and his sister, Helen. The first impression, smoke victims, collapsed when responders saw damage that fire does not explain. Later, pathologists would confirm what the heat had tried to erase. Shotgun blasts, close enough to mark, far enough to spread. A sawn-off had spoken in the farmhouse before the fire ever took hold. What happened inside those rooms? Investigators reconstructed it as a sequence. Entry, forced but contained. No wild ransacking, more like selected searching. Then coercion, bindings, demands, shots, deliberate. And staging, curtains drawn, doors arranged, accelerant placed to pull flame through ground floor corridors and confuse the origin. Cash missing, valuables removed. Organized, yet reckless, because fire is an unreliable accomplice. It destroys what you need and leaves what you meant to hide. Rumors swirled, because they always do when wealth, land, and a family name sit in the same sentence. Richard, a farmer with property, finances that neighbors argued about at pub tables. Could this be debt, a grudge, a dispute turned lethal? Police had to test that hypothesis, walk bank statements, interview business contacts. But here is the twist. The shotgun wounding matched other aggravated burglaries in method, not in motive. The bindings were familiar. The tone of control echoed through survivor statements from previous attacks. This did not read like a feud. It read like a ritual extended to its end. Forensics struggled in the heat's aftermath. Fire damaged fibers to ash. Blurred blood spatter into char. But certain things persist. Shotgun wadding, small, cylindrical, often plastic or fiber, was found in fragments that, once cooled and catalogued, could be compared to other scenes. Tool marks on a pried window had signatures consistent with a particular crowbar width. Footwear impressions in ash, partial, suggested a boot rather than a shoe. None of that, alone, could name a man. Together, it whispered that the same hands had been practicing, then escalated. The community response shifted from precaution to panic. 2 people executed in their home, then burned, meant the intruder was not content to scare and steal. He could erase. Farmers who had slept lightly now slept with lights on, a shotgun beside the bed, dogs restless in hallways. And yet, for all this, there was not a suspect who fit cleanly. The offender was likely local. Nobody else navigates those lanes in the dark. Nobody else knows which windows sit in shadow. But local describes hundreds of men in a county like this. Microstory. A neighbour, seeing smoke lift straight because the wind had dropped to nothing, called for help and watched the plume thicken, counting minutes. He knew the layout, knew the Thomases' routines, knew he could not get inside without choking. Later, He would stand behind a tape line while yellow jackets moved through blackened doorways, and he would realize that the fear that started as burglary talk had just turned into something else, something colder. Investigators split their time between the burn and the balance sheet. If it was not financial, then this was a predator testing his ceiling. The sawn-off made sense here. Shorter weapon, easier in hallways, devastating at close range. The staging made sense too. Set fire, force a narrative of accident or suicide, muddy time of death. But one problem kept surfacing. The fire could not hide the sequence. Shots came first, flame after. That order matters. What nobody knew at the time was that this scene, for all its heat, would cool into a template. The intruder had learned that erasure buys months, sometimes years, and that a scattered rural force takes what the fire gives them. 2 years later, on a windy strip of coast where tourists walk to clear their heads, that template would return, without the flames, with the same cold logic, and the county would feel the echo. 2 years on, the fear had settled into habit, but the coast still felt safe. Peter and Gwenda Dixon came for what most visitors seek on the Pembrokeshire path. Wind, long light, the steady rhythm of waves. They were on holiday, away from routine, carrying a camera to catch small joys. That randomness is what unsettled the most. They were not part of the rumour network. They were not farmers with cash tins. They were strangers who trusted the view. They walked the path, met other walkers, ate, took photos. The last hours were ordinary, and that is the point. When police reconstructed their day, nothing suggested risk until the moment it did. On a narrow section near shrubs and gorse, with sight lines broken and footsteps muffled by grass, someone intercepted them with a sawn-off shotgun. The language would have been familiar to survivors from inland burglaries. Short commands, a tone that brooked no argument, references to what they were carrying. He controlled the scene within seconds. They were bound, wrists secured with rope that would later be catalogued for twist and fibre, and robbed. Watches, cash, anything of value. Then the decision that defines this case. Execution. 2 close-range shotgun blasts, deliberate, clinical. Bodies moved off the path, into cover. Concealment was good enough to buy time, not burial, just distance from casual walkers. The psychology of the moment is important. On the path, the offender had no walls, no curtains, no darkness to hide in. He compensated with speed, aggression, and a plan to remove his victims from immediate sight. Evidence followed the weapon. Rope bindings, a distinctive shortened shotgun implied by pellet spread and wadding characteristics, and footprints blurred by coastal soil. Forensic teams would later note the wadding type and the way pellets patterned in the Dixons' clothing. That spread told experts about barrel length and distance, but one detail would draw a line years later. The Dixons' camera contained a photo of a man in blue athletic shorts, on the same path, captured around the time of the attack window. He was not identified then. In hindsight, the colour and style would matter. The human detail lands hardest. Their routines were gentle, walking, pausing for a view, sharing a joke while framing a shot. Then erasure, family members waiting for calls that did not come, search teams sweeping cliffs and bays, helicopters thumping air over scrub. When bodies were found, shock rippled from the coast across the county. This was not about cash lying in farmhouse drawers anymore. Tourists, the safe heart of a summer economy, could be targeted at random. Policing the path posed a new challenge. A mobile offender could vanish into hedged lanes, car parks, or footpaths leading back to farms. Geographic profiling, as practiced in 1989, lacked the software and data depth that later teams would rely on. Officers built a map by hand, pinned sightings, interviewed walkers. Composite sketches emerged, based on glimpses. Age, range, build, a face half-turned. But the face in composites never quite locked to a name. Patrol surges could not cover miles of coastline, and the offender knew how to use time of day and terrain to his advantage. Media pressure spiked. National outlets aired appeals. The image of a happy couple turned into a national symbol of vulnerability. Tips flooded in. A man seen loitering near a car park, a stranger asking for directions, a rough accent overheard. Leads were tested, then fell apart. And yet, for all this motion, the forensic corps stood quiet. A shotgun signature, rope, and that camera photo with a figure in blue shorts that investigators could not place. What stands out now, in retrospect, is the precision. Tie, rob, move, execute, conceal. No fire this time. because flame on open ground would draw eyes for miles. Instead, concealment relied on the landscape, on the polite assumption that walkers do not push through gorse. The same dominance from the burglaries translated outdoors. While homicide teams chased phantoms along the coast, a different file grew inland, where a survivor of a home invasion remembered a detail that would not let go. Blue athletic shorts, cheap, synthetic, the kind that shed fibers easily. At the time, nobody connected the path to the living room. Burglary and coastal murder felt like different worlds, linkage blindness again. In the aftermath, the county lost its casual evening walk. Locals timed routes to daylight. Tourists asked for safer paths. The term chilling mystery fits here, because motive felt thin. Why kill when you already had the valuables? Investigators considered control, the removal of witnesses, the offender's fear of being seen, and if he had already crossed the line at Scoveston Park, execution was not a leap, it was a method. The Dixons' deaths forced a wider lens. Was the offender seasonal, drifting with summer traffic, or embedded, using the path like a back garden? In hindsight, the answer sat closer to home. But that would take years, new leadership, and a cold case team willing to tear apart the old boxes and start again, fibre by fibre, image by image. While homicide teams worked the coastline, the Owens locked their doors and tried to live quietly. It was 1996, years after the Dixons, but the fear had not fully left West Wales. One night, an intruder arrived, with the same economy of movement and the same blunt instrument of control, a sawn-off shotgun. The entry was quick, telephone line cut, lights managed, voices pushed low. He bound them first, wrists forced behind, ankles secured with rope that would later be measured for twist and ply. He kept the shotgun close, spoke in short, clipped commands, and moved with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this room without ever being inside it. He knew what to ask for: cash, jewelry, small items that travelled easily, and he treated every answer as provisional, pushing for more. The psychology of the moment is important. Control was not just about threats. It was about repetition, timing, and the sense that resistance would be punished immediately. The assault that followed deepened the pattern. Sexual violence is often about power, not impulse, and here it read as ritual. He handled the victims like problems to be solved, not people, using humiliation to lock in compliance. He searched drawers, lifted cushions, stepped carefully to avoid noise. And then, a detail that should not have mattered but would. Blue athletic shorts. Cheap, synthetic, the kind that cling when warm and shed when abraded. In the heat of the encounter, the Owens registered those shorts the way survivors do, anchoring memory to one bright, incongruent thing when everything else blurs. He had a rough West Wales accent, not theatrical, just ordinary, but flattened by purpose. He swore in bursts, then went quiet. He seemed fixated on whether anyone had seen him approach, asking the same question twice, as if testing for a lie. Gloves stayed on, a balaclava masked his face. He left with cash and items he could pawn, then paused at the doorway to look back. That small delay would later feel like calculation, a mental checklist before vanishing into the dark. Forensics catalogued what the intruder tried not to leave: glove impressions on a door edge, a partial footprint with a wide heel, rope fibers, and the Owens clothing carrying a constellation of microfibers. One thread family stood out: blue, trilobal, synthetic. Labs flagged it, but context was missing. In 1996, without a suspect garment to compare, you could only say what a fiber was, not whose it was. The shotgun wadding type echoed prior scenes, but again, many guns produced similar signatures. Linkage blindness did the rest. Burglaries and sexual assaults sat in one stack, the farm murders in another, the coastal double homicide in a third. Teams shared briefings but not a unified narrative. Investigators considered local offenders with burglary histories, but nothing stuck. The Owens, like others, went home from hospital to a house that no longer felt like theirs, carrying trauma that does not track to a court calendar. And yet, what stands out now in retrospect is the precision with which the survivor detail, blue shorts, would later clip into a separate puzzle piece from the coast. At the time it sounded trivial, even arbitrary. Shorts? In Wales? But fibers from those shorts had a rare cross-section that, years later, modern microscopy could separate from the generic. The detail did not solve the case. It waited for the case to catch up. Microstory. Days later, an officer returned the Owens' belongings in a brown evidence bag. An old jacket felt heavier than it should. In its lining, a lab tech would eventually find those same blue fibers, pinned in place by static and time. It was not dramatic, not a smoking gun. It was quiet, clinical, cumulative, and unknown to almost everyone. A television archive already held a face with the same build and the same casual brag about coastal life, recorded on tape, waiting to be found. Years passed. Boxes settled into archives, paper yellowed, victims aged into quiet. Then a new detective walked into the storeroom and refused to accept silence as closure. Detective Steve Wilkins took over in the early 2000s with a simple premise. If the story made no sense, maybe it was because the pages were in the wrong order. He called it Operation Ottawa, a cold case team with a mandate to rebuild, not just review. The psychology of the moment is important. Cold cases die when pride defends old conclusions. Wilkins did the opposite. He broke the case apart, offence by offence, then stacked them by behaviour, not by legal category. Burglaries with a sawn-off shotgun, bindings with a particular rope twist, intimidation with sexual humiliation, arson used as erasure, farm murders here, coastal executions there, the Owens assault in another tray. Then, carefully, he slid them closer. Digitizing the files mattered. What once lived as scattered statements and photocopied lab sheets became searchable text and tagged exhibits. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Forensic science had changed. Sensitivity in DNA detection had leapt forward. Microfibers could be classified by cross-section shape, and shotgun wadding, once dismissed as common, could be compared for manufacturing differences and residue composition. Old exhibits, carefully bagged, could speak again. They built a short list of men who matched the geography, the behavior, and the timeline. One name kept landing back on the desk. John Cooper. Local labourer, prolific burglar with a violent edge, comfortable in fields and on the coast. A man whose life intersected the lanes and footpaths that ran like veins through the case. His past convictions mattered. In the late 1990s, he had gone down for a string of burglaries and an armed robbery. The kind of career that teaches an offender how to control a room and vanish into hedges. What stands out now in retrospect is how cleanly his timeline aligned. The sprees in the late 1980s, the murders in 1985 and 1989, then a dip during periods when he was behind bars, release, and the Owens attack in 1996. Investigators considered coincidence, then rejected it. Too neat, too many overlaps of place and method. But a hunch is not evidence. Wilkins needed links that a jury could hold. So the lab went to work. Fibers were re-examined under modern microscopes. That blue trilobal synthetic, the whisper from the Owens clothing, took on sharper edges. The team sourced exemplars from period athletic wear, mapped dye formulations, and narrowed the field. It was not a barcode, but it was a rarer class than anyone thought in 1996. Rope was revisited. The twist, the fiber content, the diameter. Each characteristic was compared to rope seized from suspects over the years. Shotgun wadding fragments were laid side by side with material from Cooper's prior haunts and recovered ammunition. They pulled glove patterns too. Even when a glove keeps fingerprints off a surface, it leaves its own trace. A weave, a mold seam, a pressure pattern. Those impressions, once photographed and forgotten, now sat in a database for side-by-side comparison. In some scenes, a distinctive triangular impression reappeared, consistent with a type of work glove sold locally. It did not name a man, but it narrowed a life. Parallel to the lab work, the team built Cooper's profile. He was controlling at home, short-tempered, with a reported history of intimidation and violence that did not always reach charge sheets. He hunted and fished along the coast, knew farm layouts, and had a gambler's need for ready cash. Neighbours remembered him as capable with tools, at ease in hedgerows, quick to turn a conversation defensive when money came up. And then there was his proximity. His routes mapped close to scenes in a way that looked casual until you traced them on a single sheet. Unknown to them, across town, a researcher trawling for public footage stumbled on something odd. A television archive entry for a 1989 episode of Bullseye, the darts quiz show. A contestant from Pembrokeshire, name, John Cooper. It was a footnote until the tape played. There he was under studio lights, nervous energy, a grin that did not reach the eyes, chatting about coastal life and hobbies. Freeze that frame. The build, the face, the age in early 1989, weeks before the Dixons were murdered. But here is the twist. It was not just recognition, it was time anchoring. Investigators could now place Cooper's look and gait in a specific window, match his facial features to composites made after the Dixons' murders, and listen to his cadence against survivor recollections of short, clipped commands. The tape did not prove murder, it proved presence, capacity, and timing. Operation Ottawa leveraged it carefully. They did not race to arrest on a television appearance. They used it to justify deeper scrutiny, to revisit search warrants, to frame interview strategies. Meanwhile, the forensic re-evaluation began to return results that built a lattice. Blue fibers consistent with the Owens offender turned up in seized clothing that had sat for years. Shotgun cartridge wadding from Cooper's possession showed manufacturing similarities to fragments recovered at murder scenes. Tool marks on a seized crowbar echoed impressions on old window frames. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. The team moved with discipline, wary of tunnel vision. They sought independent corroboration for every link. Lab confirmation, witness context, documentary proof. And as the lattice tightened, they felt something rare in cold casework. A coherent narrative emerging from static. The burglaries, the assaults, the fires, the coastal executions. Not separate storms, but bands of the same weather system, circling one man. They threaded the cassette into a deck and let the grainy color fill the screen. Studio applause, the soft thud of darts, and then the host's voice. Name, hometown, hobbies. John Cooper smiled, shoulders squared like a man used to manual work, hands restless at his sides. He talked about the coast, fishing, walking, getting out along the path. In hindsight, that casual line lands hard. At the time, it was small talk. For investigators, it was an anchor in the calendar and a body on camera in early 1989. Freeze on his face. Composite sketches drawn after the Dixons' murders had hinted at a certain jawline, a flattened nose bridge, deep-set eyes. On the tape, you could map those shapes without squinting. Age approximation 2, mid-40s, the bracket witnesses offered. He was not a dead ringer for every sketch, but the overlap was unsettling, and the body carriage mattered. Slight forward lean, feet planted wide, a gait revealed in the walk to the board, heel heavy, deliberate, like a man used to uneven ground. What stands out now in retrospect is how the tape let the team collapse guesswork into measurement. They could extract stills, compare interocular distances, jaw width, ear position, not a courtroom identification, but a rigorous fit against witness composites. Then there was his cadence. On Bullseye, Cooper answered in clipped bursts, with a rough West Wales inflection. Survivors from burglaries and assaults remembered that same compression of speech. Orders delivered without filler, pause, repeat. It is not proof, but in cold case work, consistent echoes matter. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. The shorts detail threaded in, too, not as costume but as class. In the studio cutaways, contestants wore casual sportswear under jackets, the late 1980s fashion of synthetic blues and stripes. Investigators were not claiming those were the shorts. They were noting that Cooper presented as the type, cheap athletic wear, the kind that sheds trilobal fibers. It connected a plausible wardrobe to recovered fibers without overreaching. The forensic team stayed cautious. Association, not identity. Timeline is where the tape earned its keep. Bullseye recorded weeks before the Dixons were killed. That placed Cooper's build, hair, and age in the precise window that mattered. Defense could argue weight change, haircuts, aging. They could not move the tape. It fixed him in time. More importantly, it disproved the notion that he was out of county or incapacitated. He was present, articulate, mobile, and proud enough of his coastal life to mention it on national television. And then there were the hands. This seems minor until you consider gloves and tools. Close-ups showed broad palms, short nails, a healing nick on a knuckle. Details that, while not unique, aligned with a labourer's profile. The way he gripped a dart, firm, no flourish, mirrored what a firearms instructor later described as a practical hold. The kind of economy you see in men who handle tools daily. Again, no single piece is decisive. The power sits in aggregation. Public reaction came later, after arrest, when clips surfaced. Viewers felt the uncanny jolt of a suspected killer grinning for prizes. But inside Operation Ottawa, the tape was not spectacle. It was a dataset. They overlaid still frames with the coastal composite, timed his stride from podium to oche, noted speech patterns. They then cross-referenced those cues with surviving victims' statements, looking for convergence, and excluding embellishment. Where facts met, they kept them. Where they drifted, they cut them away. But here is the twist. The tape did not just bolster identification, it shaped search strategies. Knowing Cooper's look in 1989, they could target clothing types and sizes in old seizures and new warrants, prioritize garments likely to carry blue trilobal fibers, and revisit photographs taken during earlier property searches for overlooked items. The Bullseye timeline helped, too, narrowing the window for when certain weapons or ropes would have been in his possession. The impact was immediate inside the team. The circumstantial web tightened into probable cause. A face on tape, a voice that matched, a build that fit, a lifestyle that put him on the same terrain as his victims. That justified fresh warrants and deeper dives into his history. It also inoculated the case against the mistaken identity defense. When jurors would eventually watch the tape, they would not see a theory. They would see a man, time-stamped, whose manner synced with the crime's choreography. With that, investigators stopped treating Bullseye as trivia. It became evidence, not of guilt by entertainment, but of presence, capacity, and continuity. And with that clarity, they moved from screens to doorways, ready to turn a living room upside down and shake loose the fibers, the wadding, and the secrets he had kept for decades. They waited for first light. Warrants signed, teams briefed, a quiet lane filling with unmarked cars. When the door opened, the tone was controlled. Search, seize, catalogue. Cooper watched as rooms he had curated for years were taken apart in measured squares. Drawers came out, carpets lifted, lofts checked. The list was precise. Shotguns or components, cartridges, clothing, ropes, balaclavas, tools with pry marks, photographs, anything that could carry old fibers trapped by time. In the utility room, an officer pulled a canvas holdall. Inside, cartridges, some unfired, some spent, kept like keepsakes. On a high shelf, taped to insulation, a plastic bag rattled, wadding and cut-down tubes that looked like attempts at homemade cartridges. The psychology of the moment is important. Men who rely on a sawn-off keep fragments, practice rounds, materials for modification. It is habit, it is pride, it is supply. In a bedroom wardrobe, garments nobody had worn in years still shed quietly. A dark jacket, coarse lining, was bagged whole. In the shed, coils of rope, different gauges, some cotton, some synthetic, sat beside a tangle of work gloves scarred by use. A balaclava turned up with a hard seam, the kind that leaves a faint ridge pattern on skin and surfaces. Officers moved slow, gloved, double-bagged, anything likely to carry microfibers. Every bag got a unique code. Chain of custody was religion. Forensics began comparing the seized ammunition to fragments from the old scenes. Shotgun wadding is often dismissed as generic, but under a microscope, manufacturing features show up. Petal cuts, plastic composition, residue profiles from particular powders. Tool marks on a seized crowbar were inked and photographed, then set against lift casts taken from frames at Scoveston Park and other burglaries. A rare triangle motif in glove impressions reappeared, subtle but consistent with a specific work glove batch sold locally in the late 1980s and 1990s. Then came the fibers. Lab techs teased blue trilobal strands from the jacket's lining, from the balaclava's seam, from the inside of an old sports bag. Their cross-section matched the class found on the Owens clothing, and dyes sat within the same formulation window. It was not identity. It was a chorus in tune. In one pocket, a hair, mitochondrial DNA testable, offered another line. Not definitive, but supportive. The case was building by accumulation, not spectacle. Investigators also pulled the money thread. Cooper gambled, bet small, lost often. Benefit fraud allegations stacked beside records of sudden cash injections after spree windows. Pawn slips linked to jewelry styles reported in early burglaries. When cash ran low, his temper rose, and the pattern of offences ticked up. This was not a master thief's arc. It was a man patching holes, using violence to bridge the gap between desperation and the next win that never came. Family dynamics filled in the psychological map. Interviews, some formal, some tentative, described a controlling presence at home, quick to anger, keeping secrets in the banal cover of sheds and drawers he told others never to touch. The language echoed the burglaries. Separation, humiliation, domination. It is risky to infer too much from domestic life, but the alignment was hard to ignore. A man who choreographed fear where he could enforce silence. Micro-story. A property clerk logged an old field jacket that felt heavy for its cut. Weeks later, under magnification, a constellation of blue fibers surfaced from the lining, wedged in seam grit. Those threads, ordinary to the eye, carried the same trilobal signature that haunted the Owens file. A small find, almost incidental, that reframed a whole assault, turning a memory of blue shorts into a lab result. All the while, case leaders hammered one rule: no tunnel vision. They pressed the labs for blind comparisons, requested peer reviews, and re-interviewed witnesses without revealing their theory. Where contamination could be argued, they anticipated it. Documented storage histories, photographed seals, logged every handoff. Defense experts would later inspect the same exhibits and have to concede the basics. The chain was clean, the methodology current, the inferences reasonable. Searches extended to outbuildings and a small loft crawl space where a wrapped, stubby tube emerged. Barrel segment, cut clean. Tests on tool chatter suggested modification by someone comfortable with metalwork. Residue swabs on the interior revealed traces consistent with older British propellants, in line with wadding chemistry from scene fragments. It was not the murder weapon, but it spoke the same language. As the file thickened, the narrative became coherent. The man on the Bullseye tape was not a coincidence frozen on VHS. He was a local offender whose life, tools, and habits intersected the case at dozens of points. The rope on his shelf matched the twist class used on coast and farm. The cartridges aligned with wadding in burned rooms and open paths. His clothes, forgotten in a wardrobe, still shed the blue whisper that survivors remembered and laboratories could finally hear. When the arrest team went back, they brought not just cuffs, but a story supported at every turn by evidence. Each piece could be attacked. Together, they absorbed blows. And in that accumulation, the hidden past he had curated in sheds and pockets turned against him. One fiber, one cartridge, one glove seam at a time. Courtrooms flattened chaos into rows and exhibits, but this file refused to sit still. Prosecutors opened with a simple frame, not isolated crimes, but an arc. Burglaries that trained a method, assaults that refined control, murders that enforced silence. The narrative was chronological, but the logic was behavioral, and jurors were invited to watch the escalation unfold like a fuse burning toward a charge. They started with the groundwork: bindings, rope twist, glove impressions, and the sawn-off's destructive voice. Then they layered the fibers. A forensic scientist held up micrographs of blue trilobal strands recovered from the Owens clothing, then from a jacket seized in Cooper's wardrobe. Different garments, same class, same rare cross-section, same dye family. Not identity, the expert said, but association with probative weight. The jury watched tiny photographs become anchors. Shotgun evidence followed. Wadding fragments from Scoveston Park and the coastal path were described, their plastic composition and petal cuts compared to wadding and cut tubes seized from Cooper's property. A ballistics expert avoided overreach. No unique match. Yet emphasized manufacturing consistencies, residue profiles, and the realistic improbability of those features aligning by chance across unconnected scenes and a suspect's stash. In hindsight, this was the moment everything changed. The room began to feel the lattice, not the strands. Then the tape. Bullseye played in brief, controlled bursts. Jurors saw a man, in early 1989, built and aged in the range witnesses recalled. They heard his clipped cadence. They watched his stance at the oach, heel heavy, shoulders forward. The prosecutor did not claim the show proved murder. It proved presence in time, corroborating composites drawn weeks later. The judge instructed carefully. Context evidence, not character. Still, the image lingered. Survivors took the stand with measured voices. The Owens described commands, the rough accent, the blue athletic shorts. They explained humiliation without spectacle, and the courtroom quieted in the way it does when cruelty is mundane. Maps came next, pins tracking burglaries, the farm, the path, and Cooper's known routes. A timeline charted his imprisonments and releases against offense waves. The pattern was tight. Defense leaned into contamination and coincidence. Fibers travel, they argued. Clothing sheds everywhere. Chain of custody spanned decades. Any breach could seed doubt. Wadding is common. Gloves are mass-produced. Composites are unreliable. The Bullseye clip, they said, was prejudicial theatre. They floated alternatives. Unknown offenders, travelling criminals, a second gun in the community. The method, they suggested, had been overinterpreted by detectives primed by hindsight, but the prosecution had anticipated the blows. Chain of custody logs were read line by line, storage conditions were documented, independent peer reviews of fibre and wadding analyses were introduced. A statistician testified not to a magic number, but to compounding improbabilities. Each individual feature might be common, but the conjunction across scenes and a suspect's belongings, aligned in time and geography, was unusual and unsettling. Jurors asked for timelines again, for stills of the short's micrographs, for the map overlay that put Cooper's life against the crimes. They did not get a single smoking gun. They got accumulation that felt like gravity. And then there were the domestic witnesses. Descriptions of control, concealed tools, unexplained cash, and sudden mood shifts tied to money. The judge warned them to treat that with caution, but patterns have a way of sinking in. The verdict came in 2011. Cooper was convicted of the murders of Richard and Helen Thomas, and Peter and Gwenda Dixon, and of the Owens attack and related offences. The courtroom air changed, the way it does when a long-held breath leaves a room. At sentencing, the judge spoke of predation, planning, and a sustained campaign of terror, life imprisonment, parole terms that recognised risk, and the time he had already kept the county hostage. In the hallway, families cried without relief, because relief does not fit easily after decades. Investigators exhaled, not in triumph, but in release from a puzzle that had held them for years. And for the community, the verdict did not rewrite history, it finally named it. In the aftermath, Pembrokeshire learned how to sleep again, slowly. Locks stayed, dogs still paced, but conversation loosened at pub tables. People walked the coastal path in pairs until the habit of checking over a shoulder softened. Relief sat beside grief. You do not just switch off decades of fear, you relearn the ordinary. For survivors, coping was not closure. The Owens and others carried a private geography. Rooms they avoided, drawers they never opened after dark. A jump at any sound that echoed a door latch. Trauma therapy offered language, hypervigilance, triggers, reclaiming space. The psychology of the moment is important. When an offender builds control through humiliation, recovery is about taking back mundane acts. Choosing when to sleep, deciding which light to leave on, walking a hallway without listening for footsteps that are not there. Families of the murdered lived with quiet anniversaries. They tended graves, kept photographs where morning light hit them, and measured justice by the jury's word, not by the end of pain. Some sat through every day of court, taking in forensic terms they never asked to learn, trilobal cross-sections, residue profiles, mitochondrial sequences. A strange education, earned at too high a cost. For the community, there was the reckoning with memory. People charted where they had seen him, at a garage, on a lane, along a hedge. In hindsight, those sightings were not clues. They were a reminder of how often predation sits inside the familiar. The phrase "Bullseye Killer" entered speech, a cultural shorthand for the uncanny overlap of pop culture and crime, for a grainy smile under studio lights that would haunt a county's archive. Policing absorbed its own lessons. Linkage analysis became doctrine, not option. Offences that once lived in separate folders, burglary, sexual assault, homicide, moved onto the same behavioural shelf when details aligned. Evidence retention policies tightened. Exhibits were stored with the assumption that science would catch up later. Cold case teams were given methods, not just hope. Digitize everything, rebuild chronologies, prioritize behaviours over legal labels, and audit old assumptions without ego. The forensic message carried to other forces. Fragile evidence matters when it is protected. Blue fibres that meant nothing in 1989 became pivotal 2 decades later because someone bagged a jacket carefully and someone else logged a chain of custody that could survive cross-examination. Shotgun wadding, dismissed as generic by one era, became comparative evidence in the next, when chemistry and manufacturing profiles were better understood. It is the lab equivalent of keeping seeds dry until you have a field to plant them in. Operation Ottawa's approach, aggregation instead of overclaiming, also reset expectations. They used analogy carefully. Each trace was a thread, and the case was a rope. No single fibre could pull the weight, but braided together, they held. Jurors responded to that honesty. The absence of a theatrical smoking gun made the presence of cumulative proof feel more trustworthy. It is a model cited quietly in training rooms. Build lattices, not pillars. There is another lesson, darker. Control at home mirrors control in the field. Investigators considered how patterns of intimidation behind closed doors track with the choreography of crime scenes. Separation, timed commands, calibrated threats. It does not convict by character. It gives context to behavior. The warning is clear. When communities treat coercion in domestic spaces as private, they sometimes miss the rehearsal for public harm. And then there is the tape. Bullseye was not magic. It was a timestamp that let investigators anchor appearance and cadence in a specific month. In a world thick with video now, the archival lesson is simple. Preserve the mundane, because tomorrow's question will often be answered by today's background noise. An old game show captured a face, a stance, a voice pattern. Years later, that ordinary footage sharpened a case file. In the end, Pembrokeshire's slow return to ordinary nights was not about forgetting. It was about integration. The county kept its hedged lanes, its wind that cuts clean across fields, its footpaths that run to the sea. People still tell each other where they are going and when they will be back. Not out of panic, but out of a shared memory that safety lives in habits. The chilling mystery that held them for decades gave way to a practical truth. Details matter, and people matter more. For the detectives, the case sits as proof of concept and a caution. Persistence works, evidence ages, but does not always die. Humility in the face of new methods can rebuild a story that pride once fractured. For the families, the meaning is quieter. A name on a verdict sheet, a routine reclaimed, and the knowledge that an archive, a fibre, and a county that refused to forget finally aligned. Let's get to the second story. They found the first body by accident, deep inside Belanglo State Forest, where the pines hold sound and the wind carries nothing back. A runner stopped, stared, and the quiet broke. Police widened the search line, and then there was the second body, close, deliberate, unsettling. Questions spread faster than facts. Who brought them here, and why were they arranged like this? To understand the forest, we need to go back to the roads leading in, months earlier, when young travellers vanished along highways south of Sydney. Silence stretched, and families called countries away, waiting for answers that never came. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Calls get missed, postcards arrive late, and people assume a detour. Here, the silence hit hard and stayed. Joanne Walters and Caroline Clarke left Sydney in April 1992, planning a budget journey. Hostels, hitchhiking, the usual backpacker economy. They were last seen heading south, looking for a lift. When they didn't call home, families tried to stay calm. A day became a week, and then the absence started to feel like erasure. James Gibson and Deborah Everest had disappeared earlier, in late 1989. They were young, Victorian, moving along the Hume Highway toward a music event. Their friends remembered optimism, a reliable pattern of checking in. Then, nothing. At the time, police in different jurisdictions logged reports, but the gaps between stations were wide, and the narrative fractured. The assumption lingered that backpackers change plans, sometimes impulsively, sometimes without notice. By early 1991, Simone Schmidl, a German traveller, fell into the same silence, last seen hitchhiking in the same corridor south of Sydney. Months later, another German couple, Anja Habskid and Gabor Neugebauer, would vanish as well. They were experienced enough to handle long roads, careful with money, alert to the usual risks. Yet they stepped into a car with a stranger and were never seen alive again. The pattern was there, but it was scattered across maps and case files that didn't talk to each other. The psychology of the moment is important. Australia in the late 1980s and early 1990s marketed openness, big skies, long roads, and a relaxed sense that if you stuck to the lanes, you were fine. Hitchhiking wasn't fringe. Among travellers, it was practical. That created a vulnerability, low situational power, relying on the goodwill or authority cues of drivers who offered a ride. What stands out now in retrospect is that the victims weren't reckless. The system they moved through made the risk feel normal. Families pushed back against the idea that their children had just wandered off. Parents called police repeatedly, crossed borders on the phone, reached out to embassies. Some came to Australia, walked the hostels, pinned flyers, visited roadside stops themselves. The pressure on New South Wales police rose slowly, then sharply, especially as the cluster of disappearances started to sound less like coincidence and more like a pattern hidden in plain sight. But here's the twist. Early evidence didn't pull investigators toward Belanglo. James Gibson's backpack turned up near Galston Gorge, north of Sydney. far from the Hume Highway. His camera gear was found elsewhere again. Those drops confused the geography and suggested movement that didn't fit a neat line. Was someone scattering items as a decoy, or were the victim's belongings moving through secondary hands, thieves or opportunists, after separate crimes? Investigators considered both possibilities, and the uncertainty cost time. Media tone at the time reflected a cultural shrug. Youth travel is transient, editors said. These things happen. The coverage was polite but restrained, often framed as last seen, believed travelling, may have changed plans. Only when families went public, when the list of names grew, did the tone shift. People began to feel the unease. The same corridor, the same methods of travel, the same vanishing point. Meanwhile, small missteps added friction. Reports didn't connect across stations. Tips lived in drawers, not databases. A sighting near Casula, a lift offered south of Liverpool, a roadside interaction on a weekday afternoon. Each fragment felt minor in isolation. Together, they trace a route. At the time, they just created noise. For the backpackers, the calculus was simple. You stand by the road, you hold a sign, you accept the driver who stops. He looks ordinary. The car is tidy. There's a tool case in the back, a jacket on the seat, maybe a casual story about roadwork or visiting family. You get in. The handshake between trust and risk feels routine. That routine became the opening move. As days turned into months, the families built rituals around waiting. Answering machines were checked constantly. Nighttime phone calls triggered adrenaline. Birthdays passed with empty chairs. What if they were just out of range? What if they didn't want to disappoint anyone by admitting a plan had changed? Grief and hope collided, and both felt exhausting. Police pressure increased again when multiple disappearances mapped onto the same highways south of Sydney. The Hume became a character in the investigation, long, repetitive, with entry ramps near suburbs and exits into bushland. That geography matters. Belanglo sits off those roads, close enough to feel accessible, far enough to vanish people without a trace. But at this point in the story, the forest was quiet, and the focus stayed on the roads, the service stations, the hostel notice boards. One detail would prove crucial later, the way belongings surfaced away from bodies. It suggested a perpetrator comfortable with movement, willing to stage confusion, confident that the space between police districts would absorb anomalies. In hindsight, we see deliberate misdirection. At the time, it read like ordinary chaos. While paperwork piled up in cities, the forest kept its silence. Families waited. The media found new angles. And along the same roads, more backpackers looked for rides, unaware that someone was using those routines, studying them, and turning them into a hunting ground. 3 days after the first runner called it in, the search line moved deeper, boots sinking into pine needles, eyes trained low. A second body surfaced within a short walk of the first, not scattered by animals, not random. The spacing felt calculated, close enough to connect, far enough to control discovery. Detectives paused on that choice. Was someone arranging the scene to communicate dominance, or to buy time? Forensic teams worked slowly, marking the ground with tape and flags. Bones, bindings, cartridge cases, fibers, fragments of clothing, each item photographed where it lay. The tall pines created a canopy that kept weather off the ground. The forest had preserved what the killer left. Bullet wounds told a sequence. One victim showed shots to the head, precise, execution style. Another bore evidence of being fired upon from different positions, suggesting movement, pursuit, or staged terror. The ballistics team logged calibers and potential rifling patterns. They would matter later. Then came the injuries that didn't match bullets. Deep stabbing, multiple sites, deliberate trauma to the spine. In one set of remains, vertebrae carried cut marks, the kind that suggest control, paralysis, or experimentation. The autopsy path was complicated by decomposition, but the violence was unmistakable. Overkill in some areas, restraint in others. The psychology of the moment is important. The killer alternated between control and cruelty, using more than one method, making choices that weren't about efficiency. That points to a motive mingled with sadism. Bindings surfaced from the leaf litter, cord, cloth strips, sometimes consistent with improvised restraints. Knots were tight and repetitive, practiced. Nearby, a length of tape, adhesive degraded but still holding fibers. These details described a scene where fear was managed like steps in a process. You restrain, you relocate, you escalate. What stands out now in retrospect is how comfortable the offender was in that environment, how assured the pacing felt. Crime scene spacing told another story. Bodies placed off fire trails, within a short carry from drivable points, but not close enough for casual discovery. The selection of clearings suggested pre-visits, familiarity with the grid of paths, and the rhythms of weekend traffic. If discovery risk rose, you'd place farther from a visible landmark. If you wanted to return, you'd pick points you could navigate by memory. Investigators mapped the placements and built a geometry of intent, corridors of entry, arcs of disposal, clusters that echoed a comfort zone. Searches expanded, grid sweeps moved methodically, and each new find pulled the net wider. A shoe with a lace, still threaded, a shirt with a torn placket, cartridge casings half sunk, stamped brass, catching afternoon light. Souvenir taking became a working hypothesis when certain personal items, known to be carried by the missing, weren't there. Cameras, jewelry, small keepsakes, gone. That absence suggested an offender who wanted tokens, reminders to revisit the power of the act, or trophies to manage private mythology. Meanwhile, staging hovered as a possibility. Some skeletal positions didn't look like where a body would fall naturally. Arms arranged, head turned, the torso oriented to a landmark. Was it ritual, misdirection, or simply a byproduct of moving bodies after death? Forensic anthropologists stayed careful, noting that animal activity and collapse can mimic intention. But they kept the question open, because certain details, the repetition of placement angles, the symmetry of two separate sites, felt intentional. Public fear hardened into routine. Parents warned backpackers away from lifts. Hostile notice boards filled with handwritten cautions. Hitchhiking, once casual, collapsed almost overnight along those routes. Police presence at freeway ramps increased, and unmarked cars watched the entries to bushland. Belanglo, once a place for dirt bikes and weekend walks, became a boundary in local language. People said the name under their breath. The roads gave clues. Tire impressions near trailheads matched common models, nothing unique, but the wear patterns hinted at an older utility vehicle, likely used for work. Broken branches at shoulder height suggested gear pulled from a rear seat or tray. Investigators considered a driver who handled tools daily, someone strong, practiced at lifting, familiar with chains, ropes, tape, roadwork, forestry, mechanics, jobs that intersect with physical confidence and access to vehicles that disappear into the noise of rural labor. And then there was the sound profile. Several searchers commented on how quickly the forest swallowed noise. You could fire a shot in the right clearing and the echo would fold into trees. You could shout, and 100 meters away it would be a murmur. That acoustic insulation matters. It allows control. It reduces risk. It turns the forest into a private room. As more remains emerged, patterns sharpened. Some victims showed signs of prolonged fear, bindings that imply transport alive, wounds that indicate escalation over time. Others seemed to have died quickly. This inconsistency didn't weaken the profile. It deepened it. The offender adjusted method to circumstance, or mood, or resistance. He wasn't improvising without skill. He was selecting. At the edge of one site, investigators found a small assemblage, cigarette butts, a makeshift seat in the pine needles, a view line toward the track. Was it a lookout spot or an unrelated rest? The team logged it, bagged the butts, hoped for saliva DNA someday. At the time, early 1990s, forensics could do less, but timelines were shifting. Evidence stored well could speak later. What nobody knew at the time was how a scattered set of earlier reports would converge on this quiet. A report from a roadside south of Liverpool, a description of a vehicle, a name offered casually to a traveller, Bill. The forest had given bodies, but it hadn't yet given a face. The placements, the bullets, the bindings, they formed a language. Investigators just needed a translation. What stands out now in retrospect is that the victims fit a narrow window. Young, mobile, often foreign, moving on limited budgets, and open to lifts from strangers. Some travelled in pairs, believing safety doubled. Others were alone, trusting daylight, trusting traffic density. Each had low situational power once inside a stranger's vehicle. Language barriers, unfamiliar roads, and the desire not to offend a driver all pressed toward compliance. The offender counted on that. Approach was simple, practiced, and disarming. A driver pulls over with authority cues, workwear, a confident voice, tools in the car. He offers a short lift, maybe to the next service station or a turn-off, routes they already recognize. Conversation starts neutral, about construction, weather, holiday plans. Then, in a practiced pivot, control changes hands. A firearm is produced, or a knife appears within reach. The tone flattens. Directions are issued. Don't move, don't look. Put your hands where I can see them. The threat is specific, the weapon close, the road empty enough that defiance feels suicidal. Control tactics show a sequence. Restraints appear, cord, tape, cloth strips, fastened with tight, practiced knots. Personal items are removed, sometimes to disable escape, sometimes to harvest trophies. The offender relocates them off the main road, not far, just enough to bury the sound and remove sightlines. Fire trails, pines as visual cover, short carries. He knows the spots that keep him hidden and calm. The psychology of the moment is important. Control is the point, not speed. He keeps them alive long enough to assert dominance, to stage fear, to decide when the act ends. Weapon use complicates the profile. Some victims were shot with a small caliber, tight shot placement, suggesting familiarity with firearms and calm under stress. Others suffered extensive stabbing, including injuries to the spine that indicate a calculated intent to immobilize. Mixed methods can mean improvisation. Here it reads like preference exercised at will. A collector's mentality appears. He uses what he has, perhaps what he enjoys, shifting between tools with a mechanic's ease. Ballistics and wound patterns, later tied to weapons found in a tradesman's orbit. That's not proof of motive, but it sketches confidence with gear. Geography is the anchor. The Hume and its feeder roads are arteries, but Belanglo is the organ. Sites cluster within a comfort zone, reachable in short bursts, familiar enough to navigate at night, bodies placed off track, yet carried by a straight spine of access routes. Meanwhile, the decoy drops of belongings north of Sydney suggest deliberate misdirection, or at least a willingness to move items to muddy timelines. That takes time, fuel, and composure. He wasn't rushing. He believed he wouldn't be stopped. Profilers read the terrain and the handling of victims and saw a solitary offender. Local enough to feel at home, mechanical enough to maintain vehicles and weapons, and socially confident enough to persuade a wary traveller into a car. Solitary doesn't mean isolated. It means operationally alone. A man who doesn't need a partner to manage terror. He likely works irregular hours, knows backroads, and trusts his ability to talk his way through a checkpoint. A history with firearms fits. So does a temper, controlled until it isn't. Souvenir, taking, cameras, clothing, small objects, signals, post-crime ritual. Tokens serve memory, control, and sometimes a private story he tells himself about power. Some items surface in secondary markets. Others never do. Absence becomes its own data point. In cases like this, trophies can reappear at home as found goods, folded into normal life. Investigators later noted foreign currency and personal gear in a suspect's possession. It matched the pattern, the quietly curated museum of a predator. The spacing of crime scenes reveals habit. He chooses clearings with predictable approach, limited lines of sight, and easy exit. He returns, at least mentally, perhaps physically. Cigarette butts near a lookout spot suggest waiting, watching for the right moment, or decompressing afterward. Was he hunting or patrolling? The difference matters. Hunting implies selectivity, patience, an eye for vulnerability. Patrol suggests routine. Here, the timing and victim types point to hunting, but executed along a route he travelled anyway. And then, the detail that tightens everything. Survivors are rare in series like this. Yet one encounter didn't end in a body. A ride near Casula, a driver who called himself Bill, a hidden firearm, a sudden escape under fire. That voice, when it finally reached detectives, would crystallize the abstract profile into a human pattern. Speech cadence, vehicle type, route choice, the exact moment when charm went cold. The forest offered the aftermath. The roads, at last, were about to offer a name. South of Sydney, near Casula, a British backpacker named Paul Onions stood by the road with a sign and a plan as simple as saving money. He'd been in Australia for weeks, travelling the way many did, buses when he could, lifts when he had to. A driver pulled in. He introduced himself as Bill. He looked like a tradesman, confident, talkative, easy with small jokes about traffic and roadwork. They headed south. The conversation moved through the usual checkpoints. Where are you from? How long are you here? Where are you headed? Onions relaxed. Daylight helps people trust. The driver wore the authority of someone who knew the roads, who'd done this route 100 times. No radio, just engine noise and the hum of tires. A toolbox sat behind the seat, a jacket folded over it, details that felt ordinary. Then the tone shifted. The driver said he needed to grab some tapes from the back. He pulled off near a quiet stretch, eased to the shoulder, and reached behind the seat. The movement wasn't casual. Onions noticed the stiffness, the change in facial muscles, the flattening of the voice. When the driver turned back, a firearm appeared. The order came low and specific. "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." Onion's mind hit the calculus that saves lives. Distance to the door, angle of the weapon, traffic density. He nodded, buying seconds, asked a question to slow the moment, shifted his weight toward the handle. The driver's eyes tracked his hands. The gun hovered, the space inside the car shrinking to breath and metal. Then Onions made the decision. He shoved the door, twisted, and ran. The driver fired. One shot cracked across the quiet, then another. Onions realized instantly how the forest swallows sound. The report dulled quickly. The fear didn't. He sprinted toward the road, waving, shouting for help. A passing driver saw him and stopped. She pulled him in, floored it, and they left the shooter on the shoulder, shrinking in the rear view, still holding the gun. At a nearby station, Onions reported what happened. He gave the name Bill, the vehicle description, the stretch of road, the feel of the man's voice when it went cold. The report entered the system, but the system at the time was a stack of drawers and inconsistent cross-referencing. The note didn't disappear, but it didn't rise. It lived in a file, disconnected from missing backpackers who, on paper, might have just changed plans. Investigators later would call this a missed opportunity, a symptom of the era's information silos. Time passed. Bodies were found in Belanglo, patterns sharpened, media coverage spread internationally. In the United Kingdom, Onions saw the story. The victim's routes, the forest, the methods, it all rang against his memory of the roadside and the weapon. He called New South Wales police from overseas. He retold the encounter, with dates, with the clarity that trauma carves. The name Bill, the area near Casula, the sudden escalation. Detectives heard in his voice the turning point their cases needed, a living witness, with details that matched the emerging profile. Investigators cross-checked old files. Onion's original statement surfaced. It had been there the whole time, a thin sheet that finally had context. Meanwhile, a separate line of inquiry had been circling a local man with a mechanical background, access to vehicles, and a temper hidden behind a polite front, Ivan Milat. Lists of firearms owners, prior incidents, and vehicle data had already placed attention near his name. Now, Paul's account offered a behavioral key. A composite built from Onion's memory and other tips produced a short list. When shown photographs, Onions pointed to Milat. It wasn't just the face. It was the bearing, the way the man held himself, the age, the eyes, when the conversation froze. The vehicle type aligned with what family and neighbours knew Milat drove. The route matched his commute corridors. The casual use of an alias, Bill, fit a man comfortable with small lies. Detectives brought Onions to Australia to formalise identification. In person, in a controlled setting, he remained steady and precise. He walked the roadside again, timed the distance from pull-off to escape point. He repeated the sequence of words the driver had used, the cadence of the command to keep still. That level of detail matters because it ties a witness's memory to physical space, to a route, to habits that don't change overnight. Jurors later would feel that steadiness. This was the moment everything changed for the investigation. With Onions anchoring the narrative, police could justify broader surveillance, wiretaps, and an eventual coordinated set of search warrants. The psychology of the moment is important. The offender believed his hunting ground made him invisible. A survivor made him visible, with a name, a look, and a map. The forest had held the bodies. A man who ran under gunfire held the thread that led back out. With Paul Onion's identification in hand, detectives moved from theory to pressure. Surveillance began quietly, unmarked cars, rotating teams, long lenses from parked vans that blended into suburban streets. They focused on a man whose routine looked ordinary from a distance, Ivan Milat, roadwork employee, early riser, careful with tools. He left home before dawn, returned at predictable hours, and kept his vehicles clean. Predictable, but not relaxed. He checked mirrors, varied lanes. The psychology of the moment is important. The hunter now sensed he was being hunted. Unknown to him, phone taps came online. The conversations were sparse and practical, often with brothers whose lives threaded through the same trades: earth-moving, mechanics, fencing. Family dynamics were tight and opaque. The Milats were numerous, interlinked, loyal on the surface, fractious underneath. Investigators logged patterns, talk of firearms, weekend trips to bushland, money suddenly appearing, foreign currency that didn't match paychecks. No one confessed to anything. No one asked direct questions. But there were slips, mentions of cleaning up, of getting rid of old stuff, of not talking on this line. Physical tales documented vehicle details that matched the emerging profile. A utility vehicle with wear patterns like those implied by tyre tracks near Belanglo. A worksite where ammunition might feel normal to keep around. Glove compartments that, when briefly left open, showed the kind of tape and cord any tradesman could explain. That plausible deniability frustrated detectives. They needed possession that was specific, not generic. Meanwhile, the family's prior file history raised uncomfortable possibilities. Several brothers had records, assaults, firearms, disputes that escalated fast. At the same time, their cohesion complicated witness approaches. Neighbors didn't want to talk. Former partners hesitated, fearing backlash. Investigators considered accomplice theories carefully, separating speculation from evidence. The working view solidified around Ivan as the operator, others as background noise, people who might have seen a thing, moved an item, heard a story, but didn't join the forest at night. The Onion's timeline anchored warrant strategy. Detectives mapped the day of his escape, then stacked it against Ivan's rostered work, vehicle use, and phone activity. Small contradictions appeared. A claimed shift that payroll didn't show. A drive logged by a fuel receipt nowhere near the job site. The pattern wasn't a confession. It was a series of dents in a story that had looked smooth from afar. Wiretaps captured a nervous tick. Ivan asking about that English guy, framing it as rumour, testing who'd heard what. He pressed a brother. Had anyone been asking around the old ute? Did the police mention Casula? The calls didn't name the forest, but the edges were clear. Investigators heard the calculus of someone deciding what to move, what to hide, and when to do it. To prevent the erasure of evidence, commanders drafted synchronized search warrants, a dawn strike across homes, vehicles, sheds, and storage, targeting firearms that matched ballistics from Belanglo, knives with blade profiles echoing autopsy findings, and personal items traceable to named victims. The paperwork was exhaustive, justified by cumulative clues, Onion's identification, geographic overlap, suspicious possessions, and the behavioral profile. In the final days before the raid, surveillance teams watched a pattern that mattered. Late-night garage visits, lights flicking on and off, trips from the house to a backyard shed with a small lockbox in hand. The restraint in those moments, detectives wanting to move, supervisors telling them to wait for the synchronized plan, was part of the slow grind of building a case that would hold. The morning of the warrants, doors opened almost simultaneously. Ivan was detained without spectacle, expression flat, asking for a reason. Officers fanned through rooms with cameras and item lists. In one bedroom, they found a hidden compartment under a wardrobe false panel. Inside were firearms, including a .22 with rifling consistent with ballistics data, parts for other weapons, and ammunition in brands logged from casings at Belanglo. Each piece went into numbered bags, photographed in place. Then came the items that stripped the case of abstraction. A camera model linked to a victim, with serial numbers etched beneath a battery plate. A sleeping bag and a tent fly that matched purchase records from a German traveller's itinerary. Foreign coins and notes in small bundles. A water bottle with a sticker a parent had described. Clothing that, when shown to families later, drew devastating nods. Investigators recognized souvenir, taking rendered into domestic clutter. Tool marks tied the knives recovered to cut patterns observed on vertebrae, widths and bevels that align like a key to its lock. Fibers from tape in a drawer matched adhesive traces on bindings recovered in the forest. A photograph of a vehicle interior, taken casually months earlier, showed the same improvised cord loops that Paul Onions had described. In the garage, a utility vehicle yielded hair fragments and fibers that would later test as consistent with victim profiles. Soil samples from the undercarriage contained organic traces similar to Belanglo's composition, pine duff, quartz grains, the kind of forensic mix that isn't unique, but gains weight stacked with everything else. The cumulative effect was a narrative held together by metal, cloth, glass, and habit. Interviews with family followed. Some brothers deflected. Those items weren't his. Anyone could have put them there. People borrow cars all the time. Investigators pressed on timeline contradictions. Who had the ute on the day Paul ran? Who kept the firearms? Who camped near the forest? The answers shifted subtly, as if consensus were being built on the fly. That fluidity read as coordination, not clarity. What stands out now in retrospect is the calm method of the search, the way detectives moved from room to room as if turning pages. The case changed tone in those hours. It stopped being a profile chasing a shadow. It became a prosecution, with anchors, ballistics, possessions, fibers, and a survivor's voice. The net, woven slowly through surveillance and patience, had closed, not perfectly, but tightly enough to hold. Courtrooms flattened drama into procedure, but the weight of objects speaks. The indictment ran long, 7 counts of murder, armed robbery, abduction, and associated firearms offences. The prosecution began with the spine of their case, continuity of possession and continuity of method. Jurors saw a map pinning Belanglo's clearings, a timeline threaded by the disappearances, and photographs from Ivan Milat's home laid out like a ledger of control. Ballistics came first. A firearms examiner walked the jury through rifling, explaining how a .22's microscopic striations act like a fingerprint. Casings recovered near the bodies showed unique tool marks, extractor, and firing pin signatures. A rifle seized under a wardrobe panel produced test rounds whose striation patterns aligned with the forest casings. The expert's cadence was cool and clinical. He didn't overreach. He said the match is consistent. The probability of coincidental agreement across this many features is low. Then the blades. A forensic pathologist guided them through cut geometry. The bevel and width of a knife edge leaving characteristic signatures on bone. Vertebral lesions, chilling because of what they implied, were compared to test cuts made with seized knives. Again, the language stayed careful, consistent with, not identical by necessity, because bone degrades. But taken with the ballistics, the convergence was hard to ignore. Fibers and adhesives followed. Tape found in a drawer, shared manufacturer, identifiers with remnants on bindings from Belanglo. Under magnification, the adhesive carried a unique additive profile. Fibers from a vehicle seat were consistent with clothing fragments recovered at the forest. Soil microscopy connected undercarriage samples to Belanglo's distinctive pine duff and quartz ratio. None of it, alone, proved murder. In aggregate, it behaved like a rope, each strand tightening the hold. Then came possession of the victim's property, serial numbers etched under battery plates, a camera strap described by a parent, a tent model tracked to a receipt. Jurors saw the inventory sheet, line after line of names tied to things found in one man's spaces. The prosecution framed this not as happenstance, but as souvenir, taking consistent with a sadistic pattern. And they had something else, Paul Onions. Calm and precise, he described the roadside, the gun, the attempted restraint, the sprint. Viewed against the forest, his survival made the logic of the case audible. The defense approached by subtraction. They denied ownership, suggested transfers among brothers, argued that workmen trade tools and goods casually. They raised contamination, questioned search methods, chain of custody, and the limits of consistent with. They gestured toward accomplice shadows, floated borrowing and coincidence. Doubt, not narrative, was their product. Cross-examination tested Paul Onion's memory. Time blurs, stress distorts recall, defense counsel suggested. Onions didn't spike his voice. He kept a cadence and anchor points, where the car stopped, the wording of the order, the weapon's position. He'd already identified Milat in photo arrays and in person. The jury watched a man who'd run under fire hold his line. When Ivan took the stand, he denied everything. He blamed brothers for items, shrugged at foreign cash, said the rifle wasn't his. His affect was controlled, almost bored, until pressed on the alias at Casula. He rejected ever calling himself Bill. Jurors studied his pauses, the half-second delays that gather meaning in rooms like this. Closing arguments returned to architecture. The Crown built its case as a structure you could walk through: bodies, method, weapons, possessions, survivor. The defense asked jurors to inspect the joints for hairline cracks. But what stood out in the end was the fit, how the forest's language translated across metal and cloth. The verdict, delivered without theatrics, guilty on all counts, life sentences without parole. Appeals followed, claiming prejudice, contamination, misdirection. None succeeded. The trial ended one story. Belanglo still held what it wouldn't say. In the aftermath, the forest went quiet again, but the case didn't. Investigators reviewed missing persons across New South Wales and beyond, asking a brutal question: were there more? Files from the late 1970s through the early 1990s were compared for hitchhiking patterns, roadside abductions, and bodies placed in bushland with mixed method injuries. Some cases felt adjacent, similar corridors, similar victim profiles, but without the anchor of possessions or ballistics, they remained unlinked. The scope debate turned into a constant undertow. 7 known murders, possibly more, likely never fully counted. Accomplice theories grew in the gaps. The Milat family's size and proximity generated speculation. Shared cars, shared sheds, overlapping routines. Could someone else have helped scout, dispose, or store items? Investigators considered each angle against evidence. The crime scenes read like the work of a solitary operator: tight control, consistent pacing, no signs of divided labor. The working conclusion held: Ivan as the principal, others as peripheral. Prison years revealed another layer of control. Ivan refused confession, even as appeals failed and health declined. He manipulated attention, letters to supporters, hunger strikes framed as protest, legal maneuvers that kept his name in print. The psychology of the moment is important. Withholding truth was leverage. For families, it was a second sentence. Silence became a trophy. Cold case teams revisited regional disappearances. Analysts cross-referenced vehicle sightings on the Hume, examined toolmark archives, and reran partial DNA from old evidence as methods improved. Leads flickered, then dimmed. Absence proved harder than presence. Public life changed in small, permanent ways. Backpacker culture reset its rules. Hostels posted safety briefings. Ride requests moved to boards, then to formal systems. Parents built scripts. Hitchhiking along the Hume thinned to nearly nothing. Belanglo became shorthand for danger. For families, time split. There was life before the call stopped, and a different life after. Parents kept landlines active years longer than needed. Siblings marked birthdays with candles and silence. Waiting became ritual. Paul Onions carried a different weight. He survived, but the roadside lived inside his nervous system. Testifying helped, then exhausted him. He rebuilt slowly, reclaiming the road piece by piece. When the noise faded, what remained were small acts of memory: bench plaques, scholarships, walks taken together, stopping before the trees.